After losing my husband, my son and daughter-in-law moved often, supposedly to help. But one night I overheard them planning to steal my house and dump me in a cheap nursing home, calling me a burden. They had no idea I was listening. They thought they had won. What they didn't know was that their meticulously laid plans were about to unravel spectacularly. Follow my story, like and share, and let me know where you're listening from. The silence of midnight was usually a comforting blanket, a gentle hush after the day's muted activity. For Eleanor, 57 and still navigating the raw edges of grief after losing her beloved husband, Richard, 8 months prior, these late hours were often spent in quiet reflection, sometimes bittersweet, sometimes peaceful. But tonight, the stillness of her old house was shattered by a sound, faint but distinct, drifting from the kitchen downstairs. Voices, not a television, but hushed, urgent whispers. It was Maxwell, her son, and Vivian, her daughter-in-law. They rarely stayed up this late, usually retreating to their temporary room by 11. A tremor of unease snaked through Eleanor. She slipped out of her bed, the worn carpet cool beneath her bare feet. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs as she recognized Vivian's voice, a little too sharp, a little too clear in the quiet house. Eleanor paused on the landing, her hand resting lightly on the banister, listening. What she had heard next chilled her to the bone, a phrase that would forever etch itself into the deepest recesses of her memory. After she signs the house transfer, we'll put her in a nursing home. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. Nursing home? House transfer? Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the meaning, to rationalize it as a cruel joke, a misunderstanding. But then came Maxwell's voice, slow and measured, sickeningly devoid of emotion. Yes, she really is a burden. Eleanor's blood ran cold, freezing in her veins. Burden. Her own son. The world tilted on its axis. The air in the hallway became thick, suffocating. Betrayal, sharp and poisoned, pierced her heart, a pain far deeper, far more insidious than the grief that had consumed her since Richard's passing. Losing Richard had been a natural, albeit devastating, progression of life. This was something else entirely, a deliberate, calculated act of cruelty from those she trusted most. This was an active wound, inflicted by the very hands that were supposed to comfort her. Maxwell and Vivian had moved in just 3 months ago, ostensibly to help Eleanor. They had arrived with solemn faces and comforting words, expressing their concern for her well-being, insisting she shouldn't be alone in such a large house. "Just until you get back on your feet, Mom," Maxwell had said, his arm around her, a gesture that now felt like a viper's coil. Vivian had been equally solicitous, offering to cook, to manage household errands, to simply be there for her. Eleanor, raw with loss, had welcomed their presence, mistaking their attentiveness for genuine love and support. She had opened her home and her heart to them. Now, from the shadows of the landing, she heard Vivian's voice again, her tone disturbingly pragmatic. "I found a perfect one, Maxwell, not too expensive, and it doesn't ask too many questions about family visits. That's key. We don't want anyone looking too closely if we decide to space out our appearances." Eleanor's knuckles whitened against the banister. Space out their appearances. The casual disregard for her future, for her very existence, was horrifying. She imagined herself abandoned, isolated, in a place where no one cared to question her family's absence. Maxwell chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Good, as long as it's cheap. That house is worth at least $800,000, Viv. Maybe more with the market right now. We need to make sure we maximize our investment." Investment. She wasn't his mother. She was an obstacle, a hurdle to jump before they could cash in on her home, Richard's legacy. Her home, a place filled with 40 years of cherished memories, of laughter, of life. It wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the repository of her past, the anchor of her future. And they saw it only as a number, a hefty sum to be claimed. Vivian then lowered her voice further, but Eleanor strained, catching every damning word. "I'll start telling the neighbors you're developing a bit of dementia, just a mild case. Nothing to worry about, just needing some specialized care. It'll make getting power of attorney much smoother. No one will question it if they think you're a little fragile. Dementia. specialized care, the cold, calculated web they were weaving. They weren't just planning to steal her home and her life savings. They were planning to steal her mind, her reputation, her very identity. They would strip her of everything, leaving her powerless, discredited, and alone. Eleanor's body began to tremble uncontrollably, a silent, internal earthquake. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but her mind was suddenly terrifyingly clear. This wasn't some fleeting thought, some desperate fantasy. This was a fully formed plan, meticulously crafted, about to be set in motion. She needed to move to escape the horrifying intimacy of their whispered plot. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor turned and crept back toward her bedroom, each step a testament to her need for silence, for stealth. Once inside, she leaned against the closed door, her heart hammering. How long? How long had Maxwell looked at her and seen not his mother but dollar signs? How long had this monstrous scheme been brewing beneath their facade of concern? Now, the seemingly innocent comments from Vivian over the past weeks replayed in her mind like a sinister reel. Are you sure you put your keys there, Eleanor? You seem a little forgetful lately. Perhaps it would be easier if I helped you manage the household bills, dear, just to take the stress off you. Each casual suggestion, each subtle insinuation, had been a brick laid in the foundation of their betrayal. Eleanor walked to her bedside table, her hands shaking as she picked up the framed photograph of Richard, his kind eyes smiling back at her. Devastated, she pressed the cool glass to her cheek. "Oh, Richard," she whispered, her voice a ragged breath. "What have I done?" Richard had worked tirelessly to provide for her, to ensure her security. The house was his legacy, a sanctuary he had built with his own hands and foresight. He had made provisions, carefully laid out a future for her, believing she would be safe. To think that their son would so readily dismantle it all, for greed. The injustice burned. Morning arrived with a cruel irony. The sun streamed through her bedroom window, mocking the darkness that had descended upon her soul. When Eleanor finally ventured downstairs, Maxwell and Vivian were in the kitchen, a scene of domestic bliss. Maxwell was flipping pancakes, their aroma doing little to assuage the bitter taste in Eleanor's mouth. Vivian hummed as she arranged fruit on a plate. "Good morning, Mom." Maxwell greeted her with a cheerful smile, as if the midnight conversation had never happened. "Sleep well? We're making your favorite breakfast. To celebrate." "Celebrate what?" Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Vivian beamed, setting a plate of golden pancakes before her. "Your future, dear. We've been talking, and we really think it's time to get your affairs in order. For your peace of mind, of course." Maxwell nodded, his eyes bright with a false warmth that made Eleanor's stomach churn. "That's right, Mom. I've gone ahead and booked an appointment with a lawyer for this afternoon. To protect your assets, to make sure everything is watertight." Protect her assets. Eleanor looked at their smiling faces, the picture of filial devotion, and fought the urge to scream. The trap was sprung, and she, the unsuspecting mouse, was expected to walk right into it. The lawyer's office was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the comfortable, slightly cluttered warmth of Eleanor's home. Chrome and glass, cool and impersonal. It felt less like a place of legal counsel and more like a carefully designed cage, with Eleanor as the unwitting occupant. Maxwell sat to her left, Vivian to her right, a human barricade in the waiting room. Their presence an oppressive weight. She focused on a point on the pristine white wall, forcing her features into a placid mask. Inside, a storm raged. Her hands, clasped in her lap, trembled almost imperceptibly, but Eleanor kept them hidden, her resolve hardening with every passing second. She would play their game, for now. She would nod, smile, and pretend to be the fragile mother they so desperately wanted her to be, until she could plan her countermove. Eleanor Thorne, Maxwell and Vivian Thorne? A young, impeccably dressed woman with a severe ponytail called their names. Thorne, that was the lawyer's name, not theirs. A deliberate choice, Eleanor realized, to confuse and disorient. They were led into a spacious office. Mr. Thorne, a man who looked barely out of law school, rose from behind a large, polished desk. He offered a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Thorne, Maxwell, Vivian, thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat." Eleanor settled into the plush leather chair, acutely aware of Maxwell and Vivian flanking her once again. Mr. Thorne began with a smooth, professional preamble. Eleanor, we're here today to discuss your estate planning, to ensure your future security and comfort. He spoke with an air of solicitous concern, yet his gaze flickered almost imperceptibly toward Maxwell and Vivian, a silent acknowledgement of their true purpose here. Vivian leaned forward, her voice saccharine sweet. Eleanor, you know how we've been talking. This house, it's just so much for you to manage on your own. The upkeep, the tax, the insurance, it's a huge property. Her words were a carefully constructed performance designed to justify the necessity of the transaction. She emphasized the burden the house was becoming, painting Eleanor as incapable, overwhelmed. Mr. Thorne nodded gravely, reinforcing Vivian's narrative. These are very common situations for aging parents, Mrs. Thorne. It's wise to plan ahead and alleviate these pressures. He spread several documents across the table, their crisp white pages stark against the dark wood. What we have here is a straightforward property transfer. It ensures the continuity of care for you, while allowing Maxwell and Vivian to take on the responsibilities of the property. Eleanor's gaze fell upon the heading, Deed of Gift and Transfer of Title. Her home, the house where Richard had taken his last breath, where their lives had intertwined for decades, was laid out on paper, reduced to a legal transaction. It felt like watching her own heart being carved out and offered on a platter. Maxwell, ever the dutiful son in front of outsiders, cleared his throat. But what about Eleanor's living arrangements, Mr. Thorne? We want to make sure she's comfortable, that she has a place to call home for as long as she needs it. His tone was laced with feigned concern, a performance so seamless it would have fooled anyone who didn't know the truth. Mr. Thorne turned a page, pointing to a specific clause. Certainly, this agreement includes a life estate clause. It stipulates that Eleanor can remain in the residence for as long as she is able to live independently. However, if her health should decline to a point where independent living is no longer feasible, the new owners would then be responsible for arranging appropriate accommodations for her care. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Appropriate accommodations. She heard Vivian's words from the night before echoing in her mind. The perfect, cheap nursing home that doesn't ask too many questions about family visits. The thinly veiled threat in that clause was palpable. They weren't just taking her house, they were building an escape route, a legal justification to remove her once they had what they wanted. Vivian then steered the conversation towards the financial aspects. And the equity, Mr. Thorne, how would that work? The equity from the property would fund Eleanor's future care, should it be required, Mr. Thorne explained, his finger tracing a line on the document. Maxwell and Vivian, as the new owners, would have full authority to manage the property, including the option to sell or borrow against it to ensure funds are available for her well-being. Full authority to sell, to borrow. The mask of concern slipped for a fraction of a second from Maxwell's face, revealing a glimmer of avarice, quickly suppressed. Eleanor's life savings, her security, were about to become their plaything. She took a slow, deep breath, schooling her features. Her voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor she felt inside. Mr. Thorne, this is a lot to take in. I understand the general terms, but I would like to read through everything carefully before signing. Every single page. Mr. Thorne's practiced smile wavered slightly. Mrs. Thorne, I understand your desire for thoroughness. However, my schedule is quite full, and there are some time-sensitive tax implications if we don't finalize this soon. His words were subtly coercive, designed to rush her, to prevent her from truly understanding the gravity of what she was being asked to do. Vivian squeezed Eleanor's hand, a gesture of faux comfort that felt like a vice. Her voice was an urgent whisper. Mom, we've already gone over everything with you. Maxwell and I have explained it all. You trust us, don't you? The question hung in the air, dripping with false sincerity. Trust them, the people who called her a burden, who planned to dump her in a cheap nursing home? The irony was so profound it almost made Eleanor laugh, but she held it in, keeping her composure. Yes, of course, dear, Eleanor said, meeting Vivian's gaze with a steady, unblinking look. But even with all your wonderful explanations, legal documents are complex. I need to process it. I need a little time. Maxwell shifted impatiently in his seat. Mom, really? We've put so much work into this. And with Dad gone, things are just so much more complicated, practically speaking. His words were a thinly veiled threat, reminding her of her supposed vulnerability without Richard, of her reliance on them. I understand, Eleanor replied, her voice firm. I will read through it, every word, and I will have it back to you by Thursday morning. Is that acceptable, Mr. Thorne? Mr. Thorne, sensing he couldn't push harder without raising suspicion, reluctantly nodded. Very well, Mrs. Thorne. Thursday morning it is. Please ensure all pages are returned, signed where indicated. As Eleanor gathered the hefty stack of papers, her eyes met Vivian's. There was a flicker of frustration, perhaps even suspicion, in her daughter-in-law's eyes. But Eleanor simply offered a small, knowing smile. They had underestimated her. They thought she was a burden. They thought she was frail. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Eleanor's quiet refusal to sign the documents immediately created a vacuum in Mr. Thorne's polished office. The air, already thick with unspoken intentions, became deafeningly silent. Mr. Thorne, clearly unaccustomed to such resistance, hesitated, his practiced composure momentarily faltering. He shuffled the papers, a slight crease forming between his eyebrows. Mrs. Thorne, he began, his voice losing some of its earlier smoothness, I must advise you that delaying this process could lead to complications. Legal complications, certainly, but also family complications. The veiled threat hung in the air, a thinly disguised warning that Eleanor's defiance would not be taken lightly. Eleanor met his gaze unflinchingly. I understand the implications, Mr. Thorne. However, I still require time to review these documents thoroughly. My decision stands. With a quiet dignity that belied the tremor in her heart, she stood up, gathered her handbag, and walked out of the office, leaving a visibly flustered lawyer and her stunned son and daughter-in-law in her wake. The car ride home was a symphony of unspoken tension. Maxwell gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw tight. Vivian sat beside him, her disappointment a palpable force, radiating from her in waves. Neither spoke, but the silence was more eloquent than any outburst. Eleanor, nestled in the back seat, gazed out the window, a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had bought herself time. Now she needed to use it wisely. That evening, after a dinner where conversation was strained and forced, Eleanor retreated to her bedroom. She locked the door, a symbolic act of reclaiming her sanctuary, and then, her hands still shaking slightly, she picked up her phone. There was only one person she could truly trust, one person who would believe her. Her sister, Beatrice. Beatrice answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, a lifeline across 3 states. Eleanor, honey, everything all right? You sound quiet. Eleanor managed, and then the dam broke. The carefully constructed facade crumbled, and tears, hot and stinging, streamed down her face. The full weight of the betrayal, the fear, the isolation crashed over her. They're trying to take my house. Maxwell and Vivian, they're trying to put me in a nursing home. The words tumbled out, raw and painful. Beatrice listened patiently, her calming presence somehow palpable, even over the phone. But what's wrong, honey? She asked again, her tone gentler now, recognizing the depth of Eleanor's distress. Eleanor recounted everything, the overheard conversation, the sinister plan, the lawyer's office, the manipulative clauses. By the time she finished, her voice was hoarse, her mind exhausted. I'm coming, Beatrice declared, her voice firm, resolute. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Don't you worry about a thing, Ellie. We'll figure this out. True to her word, Beatrice arrived on Wednesday morning, pulling her compact car into Eleanor's driveway just as Maxwell and Vivian were preparing to leave for work. Eleanor, who had been watching from the living room window, felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. Maxwell, carrying his briefcase, paused on the porch, a look of utter confusion on his face. Aunt Beatrice, what are you doing here? Beatrice, a woman of elegant simplicity and sharp intellect, gave him a calm, disarming smile. Maxwell, dear, I came to visit my sister. It's been too long, and I thought Eleanor could use some company. Her gaze lingered on Vivian, a subtle message in her steady blue eyes that Vivian, fortunately, seemed to miss. Eleanor walked out onto the porch, embracing Beatrice tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her sister's lavender perfume. Over Beatrice's shoulder, she whispered, "Thank God you're here." The words were heartfelt, a silent plea for rescue. Maxwell and Vivian, clearly put off by the unexpected arrival, quickly made their excuses and departed, their usual morning cheer noticeably absent. As soon as their car was out of sight, Eleanor led Beatrice inside, the lawyer's documents clutched in her hand. Beatrice, a retired paralegal, took the thick stack of papers and settled onto the sofa, her expression growing increasingly grim as she read. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned each page, occasionally pausing to highlight a phrase or underline a clause. Eleanor watched her, a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. After a long, tense silence, Beatrice looked up, her face darkened with concern. "Eleanor," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "this is worse than you described. Much worse." Eleanor braced herself. "How much worse?" "This isn't just a property transfer, Ellie. This is a complete surrender of your rights. If you had signed this, you would have no legal claim to this house. You wouldn't even be a legal resident. You'd be a mere tenant, entirely at their mercy." Beatrice tapped a finger on a particularly insidious clause. "It says here the new owners, Maxwell and Vivian, would have sole discretion to determine what constitutes independent living. Do you understand what that means? They could decide on a whim that you're no longer independent and force you out, with no legal recourse." Eleanor's breath hitched. She had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed, stripped bare of legal jargon, was terrifying. She swallowed hard, then began to recount everything, the full, ugly truth, the overheard conversation, the chosen nursing home, the chilling nonchalance with which they discussed her removal, even their plan to potentially use the house's equity to buy a lake house once she was out of the way. Beatrice listened, her face growing sterner with each detail. Her sister, her only living sibling, had been targeted, exploited by her own son. When Eleanor finished, Beatrice slowly closed the document. Her eyes held a fire Eleanor hadn't seen in years. "They're going to try to paint you as mentally unsound, aren't they?" Beatrice mused, more to herself than to Eleanor. "To justify the power of attorney, to make the nursing home transfer easy." Her lips thinned into a grim line. "Don't you worry, Ellie. We will turn this around. I'm going to start by investigating that nursing home they mentioned. And then we're going to make sure their claims about your mental state are very publicly and very thoroughly disproven." The battle lines had been drawn, and Eleanor, with Beatrice by her side, was no longer alone. The moment Maxwell and Vivian's car pulled out of the driveway, Beatrice sprang into action. With the documents spread across the dining table, she pulled out her phone, a determined glint in her eyes. "All right, Ellie," she announced. "First things first, let's look into this Sunset Manor they're so keen on." Eleanor watched, a mixture of dread and grim anticipation churning in her stomach, as Beatrice began making calls, her voice calm and professional as she navigated the labyrinthine world of public records and healthcare agencies. Within a few hours, the picture Beatrice pieced together was horrifying. She set her phone down, her face pale with disgust. "Eleanor, that place isn't just cheap, it's a nightmare. Sunset Manor has a long history of violations. Understaffed, unsanitary conditions, multiple reports of neglect, residents losing significant weight, not receiving their medication on time. The state has disciplined them numerous times, but they seem to just pay the fines and carry on." Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, bile rose in her throat. This was where they intended to send her. Not a place for care, but a place for convenient, inexpensive warehousing, where she would slowly waste away, forgotten. The image of Richard's kind face flashed in her mind, and a fresh wave of grief, mixed with burning rage, washed over her. This was not grief for the dead, but fury for the living, for the betrayal by her own flesh and blood. Beatrice continued, her voice hardening. "And it gets worse. I also made a few discreet calls to some of your neighbors, specifically Mrs. Lee." Eleanor's heart sank. Mrs. Lee was a kind, elderly woman who lived next door, a trusted friend of many years. "Vivian," Beatrice said, her voice laced with venom, has been systematically spreading rumors about you, telling Mrs. Lee and others that you're showing signs of dementia, that you're becoming forgetful and confused. Mrs. Lee was genuinely worried, Eleanor. She was even considering calling social services, convinced you needed help. The breath left Eleanor's lungs in a silent gasp. This was a new level of depravity. Not only were they stealing her future, but they were actively poisoning her past, shattering her relationships, and destroying her good name. Vivian, with her sweet smile and seemingly helpful demeanor, had been meticulously constructing a false narrative, isolating Eleanor, making her seem unstable and unreliable to the very people who cared about her. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, it made Eleanor's head spin. "And then there's Mr. Thorne," Beatrice continued, her gaze piercing. "I did a quick background check. Not a family lawyer as we suspected. He's been disciplined twice by the state bar for questionable practices, specifically involving elderly clients and their estates. He specializes in what he calls asset protection. But in reality, it's a euphemism for helping families exploit and steal from their older relatives." Eleanor's mind raced. So they didn't just stumble upon him, did they? The question was rhetorical. A chilling realization dawned upon her. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision born of opportunism. This was a deliberate, premeditated scheme. Beatrice nodded grimly. "Exactly, it's a playbook, Eleanor. A well-worn one, apparently. I found some disturbing online forums, discussion groups where people share advice on how to get elderly parents declared incompetent. They refer to it as necessary intervention for cognitive decline. It's sickening." She pulled up a web page on her tablet, showing a list of bullet points. Document every instance of forgetfulness, no matter how minor. Convince sympathetic neighbors to corroborate stories of decline. Find a doctor who is understanding of the family's concerns. Consult with an elder law attorney specializing in asset protection. Secure power of attorney and then property transfer. Eleanor stared at the screen, her blood running cold. "They've been following a playbook," she whispered, the words barely audible. Every casual comment, every leading question, every subtle suggestion now clicked into place, forming a horrifying tapestry of manipulation. Beatrice's expression hardened further. This level of organization, the specific language they use, the choice of lawyer, it all points to experience. "I wouldn't be surprised, Eleanor, if Vivian has done this before." The thought sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Was her son's wife a predator? A seasoned con artist preying on vulnerable elders? The possibility was terrifying. That evening, dinner was an excruciating affair. Maxwell and Vivian, seemingly oblivious to the seismic shift in Eleanor's understanding, were in high spirits. They chatted animatedly, asking Beatrice about her drive, about her life, completely unaware that their entire scheme had been meticulously dismantled by the very woman they now welcomed to their table. "So, Aunt Beatrice," Maxwell began, his voice oozing false warmth, "now that you're here, perhaps you can help us convince Mom about the legal documents. It's really for her own good, you know, just to simplify things." Vivian chimed in, "Yes, Eleanor has always been a little resistant to change, Beatrice. It's a big house to manage alone. We just want to protect her, ensure her future." Eleanor struggled to meet their gaze, the hypocrisy a bitter taste in her mouth. She wanted to scream, to expose their lies, but Beatrice's subtle hand on her arm, a silent signal, kept her grounded. Beatrice smiled, a gentle, understanding smile that belied the fury in her eyes. "Eleanor and I have already had a long chat about everything, Maxwell, and I completely agree with her. These are incredibly important decisions, and rushing them would be unwise. It's absolutely crucial that Eleanor feels entirely comfortable and understands every single detail before making such a significant step." Her words, outwardly supportive of Eleanor's need for time, were a subtle but firm rejection of their manipulative tactics. Maxwell and Vivian exchanged a glance, their smiles faltering, sensing an unexpected obstacle in their path. The battle had just begun, and Eleanor now had a formidable ally. This story is far from over, and the twists keep coming. If you're finding Eleanor's journey compelling, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more incredible stories to life. The morning after Beatrice's arrival, Eleanor faced Maxwell and Vivian over the breakfast table, an invisible script guiding her words. Beatrice sat beside her gaze a subtle warning, a silent prompt for Eleanor to maintain her composure. "I've been thinking," Eleanor began, her voice a little hesitant, as if still processing her thoughts. "Maxwell, Vivian, you're right. I think I've been making things more complicated than they need to be. It's a lot to take on this house." Vivian's face, which had been tight with barely concealed irritation, instantly brightened. A relieved smile spread across her features, making her seem almost giddy. "Oh, Mom, really? So you're ready to move forward with the plan?" Her eagerness was a stark reminder of their avarice. Eleanor nodded slowly, keeping her eyes on her plate. "I think so. It would certainly take a load off my mind." She paused, then added as if an afterthought, "But since Beatrice is here and she knows a bit about these things, I'd really appreciate it if she could just look everything over first. Just a final check for my peace of mind before I sign anything." Maxwell's smile, though still present, tightened around the edges. Eleanor noticed a fleeting tension in his jaw, a momentary flicker of concern in his eyes, quickly masked. He clearly didn't relish the idea of Beatrice, a retired paralegal, scrutinizing their carefully laid trap. But to refuse would raise suspicion. "Of course, Mom," he said, forcing a cheerful tone. "Whatever makes you comfortable." Vivian, still basking in the glow of Eleanor's apparent capitulation, enthusiastically agreed. Later that night, in the privacy of Eleanor's bedroom, the two sisters laid out their next steps. The documents from Mr. Thorne were spread across the bed, each clause now fully understood for its malicious intent. "We need a real lawyer, Ellie," Beatrice stated, her tone firm. "Someone ethical, who specializes in elder law, not elder exploitation." She tapped a finger on one of Thorne's clauses. "And they need to see these along with all your original property deeds, Richard's will, and any trust documents he might have set up. Given how meticulous Richard was, I have a feeling he might have included some protective provisions." Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you really think so, Bea?" Beatrice met her gaze, her eyes kind and reassuring. "I know so. And more importantly, Eleanor, I want you to remember something. You are not incompetent. You are not losing your mind. You are a grieving widow who has been skillfully manipulated and lied to by your own son and his wife. There is a vast difference, and we will prove it." Her words were a balm to Eleanor's wounded spirit, a much-needed affirmation of her sanity and strength. Richard. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing her husband. He had always been so careful, so thoughtful, especially with their financial and legal affairs. He had spent weeks, even months, working with their old family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, putting everything in order after his diagnosis. Could he have foreseen such a betrayal? Had he, in his wisdom, built in safeguards against this very scenario? A flicker of determination ignited within Eleanor. There had to be something. Something Maxwell and Vivian didn't know about. Thursday morning found Eleanor and Beatrice not at Mr. Thorne's office, but at the office of Brenda Hayes, an elder law specialist recommended by one of Beatrice's former colleagues. Brenda was a formidable woman, her expression serious as she listened intently to Eleanor's story, interjecting only with precise, clarifying questions. When Eleanor finished, Brenda leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "Miss Thorne, what you're describing is a clear case of elder financial abuse, compounded by emotional manipulation and attempted coercion. It's despicable and unfortunately far too common." Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction at having her experience validated by a professional. "So what can we do, Brenda?" "First, I need to see all original documents related to your property. That includes the house deed, Richard's last will and testament, and any trust documents he may have established. These are crucial. If Richard included specific provisions, it could render any attempted transfer null and void." Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly. "The problem is all those documents are at home, in Richard's old study. Maxwell and Vivian know where they are. How can I get them without raising suspicion?" Beatrice, ever practical, interjected. "We'll need to make copies. Tell Maxwell and Vivian you need them for insurance purposes. or updating beneficiary information. Something innocuous that they won't question. We can say Mr. Thorne's office advised it. Brenda nodded in agreement. That's a good strategy. If Richard, for example, placed the house in a trust with you as the sole beneficiary and stipulated that it could not be sold or transferred without your explicit consent and a review by an independent attorney of your choice, then their entire scheme falls apart. Even if he simply bequeathed the property to you outright, without any restrictions on your ability to sell or manage it, it would still make their deed of gift legally questionable if you were under duress or deemed incompetent. Eleanor felt a spark of hope. Richard, bless his meticulous soul, might have built a fortress around her without her even realizing it. They concluded their meeting with a plan. Eleanor would retrieve the documents, and Brenda would prepare a strategy to counter Maxwell and Vivian's machinations. Upon returning home, the air in the house was thick with expectation. Maxwell and Vivian were waiting in the living room, looking tense, almost agitated. "Mom," Maxwell began, his voice strained. "Mr. Thorne called. He said there are some very important tax advantages that we'll lose if these documents aren't signed by tomorrow morning. It's quite urgent." Vivian nodded emphatically. "Yes, Mom, it's for your benefit, truly, and ours, of course, but mainly yours. We wouldn't want you to miss out." Eleanor looked at their anxious faces, the desperation for her signature now plainly visible. She took a deep breath, picturing Brenda Hayes's resolute face, Beatrice's unwavering support. "All right," Eleanor said, her voice calm, almost placid. "You're right, I don't want to lose any advantages. I will sign them." A wave of relief visibly washed over Maxwell and Vivian. Their smiles returned, awed and triumphant. "But," Eleanor continued, holding up a hand, "before I do, I need to gather some documents from Richard's study. For my insurance company, they've been asking for updated copies of the house deed and Richard's will. Just routine, post-passing stuff. I want everything to be in order for when I sign the transfer tomorrow." The words were a bitter lie, but they served their purpose. Maxwell and Vivian, completely duped by her apparent compliance, readily agreed. The trap was set, not for Eleanor, but for them. "Why do you need them, Mom?" Vivian asked. Her brow furrowed with suspicion as Eleanor prepared to retrieve the documents from Richard's study. The forced sweetness had vanished, replaced by a thinly veiled impatience. Eleanor maintained her calm demeanor. "Oh, the insurance company," she explained, waving a dismissive hand. "They sent a letter a few weeks ago asking for updated copies of the house deed, Richard's will, the usual. You know how these things are after a passing. Just routine." She managed a small, convincing sigh. "They want me to review everything myself before I send it to them. Something about ensuring accuracy." Maxwell, ever the helpful son, stepped forward. "I can handle that for you, Mom. Just tell me where they are, and I'll make the copies and send them off." He reached for her hand as if to take the task from her. Eleanor pulled her hand back gently. "That's so thoughtful of you, dear, but they specifically said they needed me to confirm it. You know how insurance companies can be. All very official." She gave them a mild, apologetic shrug. "I'm just trying to make sure everything's in order for tomorrow, for when I sign the transfer." Maxwell and Vivian exchanged quick, uneasy glances. They were clearly frustrated, but Eleanor's seemingly reasonable explanation, coupled with her apparent readiness to sign the next day, left them with no plausible objection. To protest further would be to reveal their own agenda. "Well, all right then, Mom," Maxwell conceded, though a flicker of unease remained in his eyes. "Just let us know if you need any help finding anything." Together, the three of them made their way to Richard's study. The room, largely untouched since his passing, still held the faint scent of his pipe tobacco and old books. Eleanor walked directly to his antique filing cabinet, a sturdy oak piece that had always been meticulously organized. Her fingers, guided by years of habit, found the small, ornate key tucked away in a hidden compartment of his desk drawer. The lock clicked open with a soft thud. Inside, the folders were, as always, neatly labeled: house deed and legal documents, will and estate planning, investment portfolios, medical records. Richard had been a man who believed in order, in leaving nothing to chance. A small, sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. He was still taking care of her, even now. Eleanor retrieved the two crucial folders. "Just these for now," she said, holding them up for Maxwell and Vivian to see. "The insurance company can be so particular." She then moved to Richard's old scanner and computer setup. While Maxwell and Vivian hovered, pretending to busy themselves by looking at old photos on Richard's desk, Eleanor made a show of scanning the documents. In reality, she was emailing them directly to Brenda Hayes as instructed. "There," she announced with a sigh of satisfaction, "sent directly to the insurance company. They should have them by now." That evening, the moment Maxwell and Vivian had retired for the night, Eleanor and Beatrice locked Eleanor's bedroom door. With a shared sense of urgency, they spread the freshly copied documents across the carpeted floor. Brenda Hayes had confirmed receipt and would review them thoroughly, but Beatrice, with her paralegal experience, was eager to get a head start. Beatrice's eyes scanned the pages of Richard's will, her finger tracing the lines of legal text. Suddenly she stopped, her breath catching. "Eleanor, look at this," she exclaimed, her voice hushed with awe. She pointed to a specific clause. "Richard stipulated that the house, this property, cannot be sold or transferred without your express written approval. Yes, but also without the approval of an independent third party, a trustee or a designated legal representative chosen by you and appointed to ensure your best interests are upheld. And this trustee cannot be Maxwell or Vivian." Eleanor stared at the words, her heart soaring. Richard. He truly had thought of everything. Next, Beatrice turned to the house deed. "And here, a life estate provision," she announced, her voice filled with triumph. "It gives you the absolute, undeniable right to live in this house for the rest of your life, regardless of who holds the title. It prevents anyone from forcing you out or selling it without your consent." The realization washed over Eleanor like a warm wave of relief, followed by a deeper understanding of Richard's foresight. He had known. He had suspected. Then, at the bottom of the will and estate planning folder, tucked beneath a stack of financial statements, they found a sealed envelope. It was addressed to Eleanor in Richard's familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter, dated just 3 months before his death. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong with our family situation. I've seen the way Maxwell has changed since marrying Vivian. His judgment seems clouded. I fear for your future, knowing how much you depend on him, and I fear Vivian's influence." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she read on. Richard detailed his concerns, explaining how he had meticulously crafted each protective provision in his will and the house deed. He spoke of the life estate, the independent third-party approval clause, all designed to shield her from potential exploitation. He even included a name and contact information for a lawyer specializing in estate protection, a Mr. Arthur Jenkins, whom he explicitly trusted to safeguard her interests. "He knew," Eleanor whispered, the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Somehow he knew this would happen. He saw it coming. The grief was fresh, but it was interwoven with a profound gratitude for Richard's enduring love and wisdom. Even from beyond the grave, he was protecting her. Beatrice wrapped an arm around her sister, pulling her into a comforting embrace. "He loved you so much, Ellie. He simply ensured that no one could ever take advantage of you. He built a fortress around you with his foresight." Eleanor clutched the letter, her vision blurred. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice filled with newfound resolve, "I'm not signing anything for Maxwell and Vivian. Tomorrow I'm calling Mr. Jenkins, and then we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." The tables were about to turn. The first rays of dawn on Friday morning found Eleanor, phone pressed to her ear, relaying the contents of Richard's will to Brenda Hayes. Her voice was calm, steady, filled with a renewed strength that had been absent just days ago. She read the clauses aloud. The independent third-party approval, the life estate provision, and finally the contact information for Mr. Arthur Jenkins, Richard's trusted estate protection lawyer. Brenda listened, her professional demeanor giving way to a note of admiration. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, "Richard created one of the most comprehensive protection plans I've ever seen. These provisions make it virtually impossible for anyone to sell or transfer your property without your genuine, uncoerced consent, and without the oversight of a trusted, independent party. Their attempts to bypass this are a clear case of attempted elder financial abuse, and we have more than enough to stop them. Eleanor felt a surge of triumph, a bittersweet vindication of Richard's wisdom. What should I do, Brenda? Go through with it, as planned, for now, but tell them the truth, Mrs. Thorne. Tell them you have legal representation, and be ready for their reaction. Eleanor hung up, a profound sense of peace settling over her. From the kitchen downstairs, she could hear the clinking of cups, the murmur of Maxwell and Vivian's voices. They were oblivious, still caught in the web of their own deceit, unaware of the impending downfall that awaited them. Friday morning was thick with an artificial cheer from Maxwell and Vivian. They were both dressed formally, ready for their triumphant visit to Mr. Thorne's office. Maxwell poured coffee with an exaggerated flourish, his smile stretched too wide. Vivian, radiating a false confidence, wore the pearl necklace Eleanor had given her years ago, a gift of love now twisted into a symbol of impending betrayal. "Ready for the big day, Mom?" Maxwell asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation as he set a cup before her. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation and steely resolve. She looked at her son, then at Vivian, a calm entering her gaze that belied the storm brewing within. "Actually, yes," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but firm. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about making things less complicated." Vivian's face instantly brightened, her smile widening in triumph. She shot Maxwell a smug glance, believing their persistence had finally paid off. "But," Eleanor continued, holding up a hand, "before I sign anything, I realize I really need to understand everything completely. Just to have all my questions answered." She feigned a thoughtful frown, her questions innocent sounding, yet designed to expose their lies. Like, what's the exact timeline for the transfer? And once I've signed, what exactly are my living arrangements? And who makes the major decisions about the house and about my care? Vivian, eager to close the deal, waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Mom, you can stay here as long as you want. We just want you to be comfortable, that's all." It was the same lie she had told Eleanor only a few days prior, a lie Eleanor now recognized with chilling clarity. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. "And if, say, down the line, I needed to move to a care facility, how would those decisions be made? And financially, would I have any say in those decisions?" She pressed, her tone even, but her eyes sharp. Maxwell, his patience wearing thin, finally showed a flicker of his true irritation. "Mom, the whole point of this arrangement would be to take the burden off you. Trained professionals would be making those kinds of decisions for you, ensuring your well-being." His words were cold, pragmatic, revealing their true intentions. Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing his answer. Then she delivered the first devastating blow. "So let me be absolutely clear. Once I sign these papers, I would essentially be giving up control over my own life, wouldn't I?" She looked at Beatrice, who met her gaze and gave a subtle, affirming nod. Eleanor turned back to Maxwell and Vivian, her eyes now burning with a cold fury. The pretense was over. "Because," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "people who truly love me, who truly care about my well-being, probably wouldn't spend their evenings on the phone planning to dump me in the cheapest, most neglectful nursing home they could find. Would they? All so they could use the $800,000 from selling my house to buy themselves a lake house." Silence. Deafening absolute silence. Vivian's face drained of all color, turning ashen, her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. Maxwell, who had just been about to take a sip of coffee, froze, his hand suspended halfway to his mouth, the cup rattling slightly. Eleanor pressed on, mercilessly exposing every facet of their calculated cruelty. "Sunset Manor, wasn't it? The one with multiple violations for neglect and unsanitary conditions? The one that doesn't ask too many questions about family visits?" Her voice, though still composed, held an icy edge. "And Mr. Thorne, your asset protection lawyer, the one who's been disciplined twice for questionable practices involving elderly clients?" The truth, stark and undeniable, hung heavy in the air. The carefully constructed facade of concern had shattered, revealing the ugly greed beneath. Their faces were a canvas of guilt and disbelief. The reckoning had begun. Vivian, her face still pale, tried to regain control, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor, what are you talking about? You're confused. We were simply looking into some facilities as a precaution, just in case you ever needed it. Nothing was set in stone. We would never. Don't you dare! Eleanor cut her off, her voice low and steady, radiating an authority Vivian had never heard before. Don't you dare try to spin this as concern. I know about Mr. Thorne's disciplinary history. I know what asset protection really means to him. This wasn't a precaution, it was a plot. Vivian's composure finally cracked. Her lips thinned into a hard line, and her eyes, once seemingly kind, now held a cold, venomous glint. You are getting older, Eleanor, she spat, her voice hardening. You do need help. You're becoming a liability. You're right, Vivian, Eleanor agreed, her gaze unwavering. I do need help, but not the kind you were planning. That's why I hired my own lawyer, an ethical one. She paused, letting the words sink in. And while you were busy trying to trick me, I was busy gathering evidence of your fraud attempt, including Richard's will, with all its protective provisions that make your little transfer completely null and void. Beatrice stepped forward, her arms crossed, her expression stern. In fact, she added, her paralegal's voice crisp and clear, not only would that transfer be legally invalid, but your actions, the planning, the coercion, the attempts to discredit Eleanor to her neighbors, that all constitutes criminal elder abuse. The law takes a very dim view of trying to strip a grieving widow of her home and her life savings. Maxwell, who had remained frozen, finally found his voice, a high-pitched protest. You can't prove any of that. We didn't do anything. Eleanor, maintaining her calm, picked up a manila folder from the table, an empty one, a brilliant bluff, and held it up. Actually, we can. Every detail, including recorded conversations. She saw Maxwell's face go utterly white. His eyes darted nervously between Eleanor, Beatrice, and the folder, realizing the depth of the hole he had dug. Mom, please, Maxwell pleaded, his voice cracking, the false cheer gone, replaced by desperation. Let's just talk about this. We can work this out. This is a misunderstanding. He reached out a hand, but Eleanor recoiled. A misunderstanding. Eleanor's voice trembled with emotion, recalling the painful betrayal. You called me a burden, Maxwell. You agreed to send me to a squalid nursing home while you planned to sell my house, your father's legacy, for your own selfish desires. You agreed to lie about my mental state. There's no misunderstanding, only betrayal. Vivian suddenly stood, knocking her chair backward with a harsh scrape. Her eyes blazed with fury, her face contorted. You'll regret this, Eleanor. You'll end up alone and miserable. Eleanor met Vivian's venomous gaze, her own eyes holding a calm, resolute power. I'd rather be alone, Vivian, she stated, her voice clear and strong, than surrounded by people who see me as nothing more than a bank account to drain. She took a deep breath, the lingering pain of their treachery solidifying into a fierce determination. Now I want both of you out of my house. You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave. If you are not gone by then, I will call the police and my lawyer will press charges for attempted elder financial abuse. Get out. The command hung in the air, absolute and unyielding. Maxwell and Vivian, stunned and defeated, slowly gathered their things. The apartment, once filled with their oppressive presence, now felt lighter, cleaner, as they scrambled to leave. As the front door slammed shut behind them, Eleanor felt a profound sense of liberation. It was a freedom she hadn't realized she'd lost, a weight lifted from her shoulders. 6 months later, Eleanor was in her kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the window, brewing coffee. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly ground beans, a stark contrast to the tension that had once permeated her home. Patricia Miller, a kind-faced woman Eleanor had befriended at a grief support group, sat at the kitchen island. It's good to see you so settled, Eleanor, Patricia observed, sipping her coffee. You look wonderful. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. I am, Patricia. Life has a way of working itself out. She poured another cup. I have some news. You remember me telling you about the apartment above the garage? I've leased it out. Chloe, Mrs. Lee's daughter, moved in last month. It's lovely having her, and the extra income is certainly a blessing. Patricia nodded approvingly. That's a wonderful idea. And how are things with Maxwell? Eleanor's smile faltered slightly, but the sadness was tinged with a detached resolution. Well, their house offer was accepted. Apparently, they struggled to afford the mortgage payments on their own, especially after Maxwell was let go from his job. And from what I hear, their marriage is under considerable strain. Vivian, it seems, isn't quite as charming when the money isn't flowing. She paused, stirring her coffee. I hear they've had to sell some of their more expensive things. A small, ironic twist of fate, a poetic justice. Eleanor had lost a son, but she had regained her peace, her home, and her sense of self. In the quiet months that followed Maxwell and Vivian's ignominious departure, Eleanor's phone would occasionally buzz with calls from Maxwell. She ignored them all. The thought of speaking to him, of even hearing his voice, still brought a fresh wave of pain. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready to talk, or if she ever truly could forgive such a profound betrayal. The wound was too deep, the scar too fresh. Instead, Eleanor found solace in the earth. She rediscovered her passion for gardening, a hobby she and Richard had shared for decades. The physical work of digging, planting, and nurturing felt grounding, meditative. As she coaxed dormant seeds to life, she felt her own spirit slowly beginning to heal and blossom. The vibrant colors of new blooms brought a sense of renewal, a quiet joy that filled the void left by her grief and the recent trauma. One sunny afternoon, Brenda Hayes arrived at Eleanor's door, a serious expression on her face. Eleanor, she began, I have some news. Maxwell and Vivian have been formally charged with attempted elder financial abuse. Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief certainly that justice was being pursued, but also a profound sadness that it had come to this, that her only son had stooped to such depths. Brenda explained the charges, detailing the fines and possible jail time they faced if convicted. This is not a light matter, Eleanor, Brenda said gently. What they attempted was serious. Later that week, Beatrice called, checking in on her. How are you really feeling about all of this, Ellie? She asked, her voice full of concern. I'm okay, Bea, Eleanor replied, and she realized it was true. It's sad, of course, but I don't feel responsible for Maxwell's choices. I gave him love, guidance, and a good home. His greed, that was his own decision. Her life, once shrinking in the shadow of grief and betrayal, had expanded. She joined a book club, attended local garden society meetings, and cultivated new friendships. The apartment above the garage, now home to Chloe, brought a youthful energy to the house, and Mrs. Lee, her neighbor, was once again a frequent and welcome visitor. Their friendship restored and strengthened. That evening, as dusk settled, a car pulled into Eleanor's driveway. A woman Eleanor didn't immediately recognize stepped out. She was attractive, with kind, weary eyes. Eleanor Thorne? She asked tentatively. Yes, Eleanor replied, a little surprised. My name is Laura Sterling. I'm Maxwell's ex-girlfriend from college. We dated for years. Laura took a deep breath, her gaze filled with a heavy sorrow. I heard what happened. I saw the news. I needed to tell you something. Eleanor invited her in, a sense of foreboding washing over her. Laura sat on the sofa, clutching her hands in her lap. Vivian, she tried to do the same thing to my grandmother about 8 years ago. My grandmother had a beautiful home, and Vivian, she was so charming, so helpful. She convinced my grandmother to give her power of attorney to manage her affairs. She painted my grandmother as confused, forgetful. Laura's voice broke. My grandmother ended up in a horrible nursing home, one even worse than Sunset Manor. And all her money, her house, it all vanished. Vivian emptied her accounts. My grandmother passed away alone within a year, broken-hearted and penniless. Eleanor felt a chill snake down her spine. But Maxwell, she whispered. I warned him, Laura said, tears welling in her eyes. I pleaded with him to see her for what she was, but he was so taken with her, so convinced by her stories. He chose her over me, over the truth, over his own conscience. Laura shook her head, a profound regret etched on her face. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I tried. Eleanor stared at Laura, a chilling realization dawning on her. Vivian wasn't just a greedy wife, preying on an isolated widow. Vivian was a predator, a seasoned con artist, systematically targeting elderly people, preying on their vulnerabilities, their trust, their families. The next morning, Eleanor called Brenda Hayes. Brenda, she said, Brenda, she said, her voice resolute. I have a proposal. I want to establish a foundation dedicated to helping elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse, from people like Vivian. Brenda listened, then said, That's a powerful idea, Eleanor. How do you envision it? I want to commit a significant portion of my house's value, after I'm gone, of course, to fund legal services, educational programs, and support networks. I want to ensure that no one else has to go through what I did alone and unaware. Richard built a legacy of protection for me. Now I want to extend that legacy to others. 6 months later, the Patterson Foundation for Elder Protection held its first seminar in the local community hall. The room was packed with seniors and their families, eager for information, for guidance. Eleanor, introduced as a survivor and founder, spoke with a quiet strength, sharing her story, not for pity, but for empowerment. As the seminar ended, a woman, her eyes wide with a familiar fear, approached Eleanor. Mrs. Thorne, she began, her voice trembling, I think this is happening to me. My daughter-in-law, she's saying the same things, making the same suggestions. Eleanor took the woman's hand, a warm, comforting grip. The pain of her own experience had transformed into a profound sense of purpose. Her voice was firm yet gentle, full of empathy and strength. Yes, Eleanor affirmed, looking into the woman's frightened eyes. We can help you. You're not alone anymore. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that Richard's protective legacy and her own would live on, helping countless others find their voice, their strength, and their freedom.